G'day, kia ora. I'm Glyn and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first of keynotes as part of the ANZSOG Future Public Service Leaders Series, and we're so pleased you've joined us from across Australia, New Zealand and beyond. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners or custodians of the land on which custodians and owners of the land on which I'm speaking to today, who are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to their elders past, present and any joining us. Over the next hour, we'll explore how COVID-19 has changed our understanding of governing and the implications for public services which emerged from lockdown. And if you think about some of the earlier accounts of plague, Boccaccio's The Decameron, for example, or Camus' La Peste, they show us a world that emerges from pandemic is never the same. Plague foreshadows radical change, social, economic, political. The 10 central characters of the Decameron, for example, escape the plague for the safety of a nice socially distanced countryside. But as they leave, they see their beloved Florence disappear before their eyes, the city suddenly deserted, people no longer willing to help each other, the bonds of what was once a familiar shared community suddenly shattered. And when eventually Florence fills up with people again, these are strangers living with a much tougher political reality. The church and the older ruling elite pushed aside for a much rawer politics of money and influence. And perhaps this will prove the message of our time. But there is another way to tell the story of 2020, and that's on the renewed importance of the public service, a strengthening of community, and perhaps a growing scepticism about relying too heavily on contractors for much policy advice and service delivery. We've seen officials perceived to handle the public health crisis with real skill, and 3 governments in New Zealand, the ACT and Queensland have been returned with enhanced majorities, suggesting the public likes how they see this crisis being handled. So what have we learned? What will be different? And what are the future paths for governance? And to help us answer those questions, we have an outstanding panel in this first ANZSOG Masterclass session. And throughout the session, we'll be using the Zoom's Q&A function. So please share your questions on the Q&A and also upvote other questions so that we can address the most popular questions toward the close of the hour. Just to remind you, this is a Chatham House Rules session. There are no media present, none invited, and the session will be recorded. It'll be uploaded and shared via email afterwards. But let's start by introducing 3 of the most senior and respected public sector leaders in our region. Katharina Lowe is the Public Service Commissioner in New South Wales since April this year. She previously worked as the Deputy Secretary across a range of legal agencies, reflecting her background in law, in education and in audit. She's praised the talented and committed professionals she finds in the New South Wales public sector, and in her capacity as Commissioner, Katharina has stressed the importance of public service delivery capability, focus on frontline positions, including on customer service. So, Katharina Lowe, welcome very much. Delighted that you could join us. Thank you. Peter Hughes is the Chief Executive and State Services Commissioner in New Zealand. He's also the Chair until tomorrow of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government. And I'm quoting him here, "I strongly believe in the ideal of public service, and I have devoted the whole of my working life to it," said Peter on his appointment in 2016. In a career with many highlights, Peter has served as a senior public servant and as Professor of Public Management at the Victoria University of Wellington. And his services to New Zealand are recognised in his appointment as a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Peter, thank you for joining us. And Peter Woolcott is the Australian Public Service Commissioner. He's also a recovering legal practitioner, having worked as a barrister, as Chief of Staff to a Prime Minister, and as a very distinguished Australian diplomat in a number of policy and representational roles. His appointment as an Officer of the Order of Australia reflected significant contributions to international relations, to non-proliferation and arms control, ideal training for someone who must now wrangle whole of government initiatives. And Peter, from tomorrow, will be the Chair of the Australian New Zealand School of Government. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Glenn.
Let's start by addressing COVID. Peter Hughes, if I may. New Zealand has led the world in containing and then largely eliminating COVID. What did it take to orient the public service toward this goal? And how will it change how public services will operate into the future?
Kia ora koutou katoa, greetings everybody. What did it take? I guess the short answer to that is not a heck of a lot. And in many ways, what we had to do was kind of get out of people's way and let them at the challenge. It's an unusual situation that we find ourselves in, and we've had a few events in New Zealand recently. Kind of three things stand out for me. In this situation, you atypically often have a clear, unambiguous goal, and that was the case with COVID. Often in public service, there are competing priorities, competing goals. You have a situation where the rules can be set aside, decision rights and delegations can be set aside, and there's always a sense of urgency. So in this situation, really, I think the primary thing we did was get out of people's way and let them get at the challenge. And the context, in a way, kind of took care of things for us. But for me, overwhelmingly, the thing that's been reinforced to me is my belief that in the public service of the future, we're going to have to get as good at working across formal structures and formal hierarchies as we are at working up and down through them historically. And it's just reinforced all of that for me over and over again. I see no possible public service that involves us continuing to work through vertically arranged departmental silos. We have to get a lot more virtual, a lot more flexible, and learn to team up across the system around common goals. So it's reinforced that very much for me, Glenn. But short answer, not a lot. This is an opportunity for all these really salt of the earth, well-motivated public servants to do what they do best, which is actually focus on the needs of New Zealand and New Zealanders and, step back and get out of their way.
Katharina, in a federation, the states play some similar roles to New Zealand, but without the full range of policy instruments open to a national government. So how has the New South Wales Public Service pivoted to face COVID?
Hi everyone, and I want to acknowledge I'm joining from Gadigal land today. So I think what we've seen under COVID is it's accelerated a number of trends that we've seen in the workplace, in particular mobility, flexibility, and the shift to digital. And of course, these trends aren't confined to the New South Wales Public Service. So in terms of mobility, we have seen large numbers of public servants in New South Wales redeployed to support the COVID effort, particularly in relation to contact tracing. In terms of flexibility, we've seen our office-based workforce pretty much pivot overnight to working from home, while we've told our frontline workers to continue attending the front line. And I also think that, that gives us a little bit of a pointer to where things will go in terms of flexibility. We've been working at increasing flexible work in New South Wales for a while, since Premier Mike Baird announced flexibility on an if not, why not basis. But I think COVID has really shown that it is possible, and in pulse surveys that we run in New South Wales, people are telling us that they want to come back in a hybrid way that combines coming to the office and working from home. In terms of the shift to digital and how we're transforming our service delivery, I think there are many examples in the New South Wales Public Service during COVID. So in the health portfolio, we've seen the rise of telehealth and hospital in the home. In the justice portfolio, we've seen the rise of virtual courts and tribunals and the introduction of prison visits via Skype. And in Service New South Wales, they've adapted their customer service app to enable a simple COVID check-in. So there, look, a few of the digital things that we've done. I also want to call out a few other things that I think we've done fairly effectively. The first one is some pretty rapidly done contingency planning. So before the winter season kicked in, my agency worked with all clusters to ensure that they had contingency plans in place to address a scenario of up to 20% of frontline and critical staff being absent due to illness or looking after family members that are ill. And we also stood up a pool of public servants in New South Wales who were trained in contact tracing, so that if there was a spike, we could rapidly get them on board and working. Another thing, probably just to echo what Peter said, I think we've seen this amazing level of close and effective collaboration across the sector, and also between the public servants and the political level of government, and also with business in New South Wales. And I think that collaboration with business in New South Wales has really been important in terms of, you know, keeping our economy going. And I think the other thing in New South Wales that we've seen is an increased use of data and analytics. So not only, you know, that health and economic modelling, we were doing a lot of customer sentiment testing throughout COVID, and that was built into how we were responding and putting out our public messages. And we were also doing a lot of analysis around the impact of COVID on specific industries, specific regions in New South Wales, and specific cohorts of citizens.
Thank you for that. I'm hoping we can come back to Service New South Wales in a minute as well, but appreciate that. And Peter Woolcott, not only is collaboration across government, but presumably between governments really central. So keen to get your view on that. In a much cited 2018 keynote you gave on challenges facing the Australian Public Service, you stressed the need for adaptation, for being able to respond quickly to political and public expectations of the service. Has the COVID experience persuaded you that that's in place, or have you seen an absence of that needs attention?
Yeah, look, thanks, Glyn. Look, the last year really has sort of rammed home the point about shifting expectations. I mean, never have expectations of the public been greater of government, and never have and I've got to say the levers have been not all at our disposal, whether it be international, whether it be part of the Federation. So when I commenced as APS Commissioner, I remember saying publicly, we've still got a long way to go in terms of doing whole of government, given the sort of fragmentation and silos in the system. And we still don't, and while we don't do whole of government all that well at that point, we certainly don't do whole of governments particularly well either, and that is working with states and territories. Now, I got to say that what the last year has done is really sort of driven us to join up in a much more integrated way. And I think that's been an enormously important part of our response to COVID. And if you look at the sort of quality of governance and the way institutions have stood up in Australia and in New Zealand, it's been one of the key drivers in terms of maintaining our safety, but also in maintaining our relative prosperity. So that's been an enormously important part of it. And the events of the past year, we sort of called off reform. The Secretaries Board sort of called off reform at the beginning of the crisis to focus on the crisis. And then we quickly realised that, in fact, the crisis itself and the way we're handling it was accelerating many of those reforms anyway. So we should get on the beast and ride it. And we did. And both you and Peter Hughes were intimately involved in the 30 review, which was really, if you boil it down, was all about a one APS, a joined up APS, and also focus on the Australian on the Australian people. And so that is a lot of where we've gone in terms of the way the Secretaries Board has operated, the establishment of what we call the COO network, the senior operating officers in all the major departments and agencies, working as a subcommittee of the Secretaries Board. And all that's been really important in terms of coordinating the sort of way we mobilise staff around the system to go to Service Australia, to go to the ATO, to do all those things around Job Seeker and Job Keeper, which have been so important, and around telehealth. And so I think that's been an enormous sort of achievement of the system. And we've obviously seen similar challenges in the way we work with states and territory governments. And again, that's been driven from the top. And you see the situation of the establishment of the National Cabinet to coordinate this response. And again, I think that's really served Australia well. It's a sort of fast-moving National Cabinet built around the leaders who are able to sort of make real-time decisions informed by experts, and the conversations were pretty confidential and real-time. And so a lot of factors have underpinned the way the National Cabinet has helped really coordinate our response. And I think some of the key factors of that has been really flexibility to implement decisions in accordance with sort of jurisdictional circumstances, really face-to-face meetings via telepresence, confidentiality of discussions and a sort of shared focus and the use of experts. I mean, the way we're so data-driven has been really important. So while COAG served a purpose, I don't think it's going to be greatly mourned. And the question now is how do we continue to go forward in this much more joined up way? And that has been fundamental, I think, to the way we've responded to the crisis.
That's great. Thank you for that, Peter. I appreciate it. I'm going to suggest we now slightly flip the conversation to think about what it means for individuals and how the demands were placed on individual public servants and what they've been expected to do. And I'm going to turn to Peter Hughes because we were discussing in preparing for this session the experience about in New Zealand how decisions made in Wellington have to be implemented in the regions and what it means to have a group of regional public servants who have to make choices. And Peter had a fairly interesting view about how it might be plausible to expect a lot more of local initiative and local leadership than maybe is traditionally the case. So I wonder, Peter, if you'd like to say a little about that.
Yeah, so the regions in New Zealand are really important because we've got a limited number of big cities, and Wellington actually is not that big. And actually the locus of the action is the regions. I was in Gisborne last Friday. Gisborne is on the east coast of the North Island. It's a beautiful part of New Zealand, but it's a place where there are a lot of challenges. And I went and spent the day in Gisborne with about half a dozen departmental secretaries, just looking at how public servants had organised themselves around some of those challenges. And at the top level, they'd organised themselves into a team of leaders. We had people from the Māori tribal groupings, we had the heads of the key government agencies, NGO sector, local government, all kind of working in a team. And what was really encouraging is they'd come up with a plan for the region. And it occurred to me that the best thing that we could do from Wellington really is to fund up the plan and get out of it. Now, I know that that's not entirely possible and that's a bit fanciful, but if you kind of think of a continuum, where at this end of the continuum, we run government departments and we run programs into places like Gisborne. We run government programs into there, over the tops of people into there. And this end of the continuum is where they come up with a plan, maybe in partnership with central government, and we fund the plan. How far along this continuum could we get? And I reckon we could get a lot further along the continuum than we currently are. And I think that would make a bigger difference. The discussion I had with them was about all the money going into Gisborne, tied up in programs, and the priorities and the opportunities, and how if they had more flexibility, they could make a bigger difference. So I reckon we should see if we can migrate along that continuum and see how far along it we could get, because I think that would make a bigger difference. Because I actually reckon they know what they're doing and they're well motivated, and I think they'll make a big difference. So again, you know, part of it is us getting out of the way. Public servants, as I often say, Glyn, I talk about the spirit of service. Public servants come to work because they want to make a difference for our countries and the people who live in them. And if we let that spirit of service express itself, with less structure and direction than we currently got, we might make a bigger difference. There you go, a little bit of heresy for you.
Let me ask Katharina about what's happening in New South Wales, and in particular, whether expectations of individual public servants have changed in light of COVID, and are there expectations of greater local autonomy, or has that not been part of the agenda?
Probably a little bit of both, Glyn. I think, you know, when I'm looking at the sector as a whole, I would say what's really impressed me is that our sector is actually the biggest public service in the region, with more than 400,000 staff. And what we've had to do during COVID is really pivot as an entire sector. So, you know, shifting that many people and, you know, focusing them, you know, has been great. But as I think Peter mentioned, it's partly getting out of people's way. They know what they need to do. And while leadership's important, I think that, you know, people have really risen to the occasion. I also think it's worth noting that in New South Wales, while overall I think we've done fairly well, what we did do was learn from, I guess, some early situations like the Ruby Princess and the Newmarch House aged care facility. So we took that learning really, really quickly and applied it so that, those situations haven't happened again. And I think it's also worth noting that we've had particular challenges in New South Wales, given the size of our population, the density of the population in Sydney, and that we take in, I guess, most of the returning travellers from overseas. So we've had to deal with some of those things as part of it.
And how did it change? What did say Ruby Princess experience mean in terms of changing how you had to operate? I understand the dynamics of the overall response, but
yeah,
how do you communicate to individual public servants?
So I think that there were some things around cross-agency, cross-jurisdiction work that needed, I guess, some clarifying about roles and responsibilities, and within health itself, probably some things around clarifying procedures and sort of updating things to reflect what was happening then. So I would say they're the learnings, and they were acted on immediately. And I think what was really good was there was an acknowledgement that we could do better, and just actioning those learnings straight away.
Yeah. Let's ask Peter Woolcott, as a person responsible for training across the Commonwealth, how are you going to sort of capture the lessons of COVID and instill them in the public sector, and in particular in the way we train those who are coming through in the next generation of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, nothing like a crisis to sort of underscore the importance of leadership. So what are we looking for in terms of our leaders, and how do we embed that in them? And so a couple of things. One is, I think what's come through very clear is a need for someone to be naturally collaborative, given just the complexity and interconnectedness of issues. And you saw that this year in COVID-19. And all of a sudden you've had our Department of Home Affairs having to talk to health in detail. But I mean, I think that's true almost of all issues we're managing now as public servants. Also, you've got to take responsibility and deliver is pretty fundamental. And this is a government in Australia at a time that is and will continue to be very focused on implementation. So that's just key. But I think what is really important is not just the what in terms of delivery, but it's also the how, the ability to manage up and down. I think traditionally that's not been one of our strengths. Performance management has been about managing underperformance, delivering, but not actually developing the strong performers ourselves and building that team underneath you in terms of succession. So that's something we're very much focused on, trying to develop those sort of high-performing teams and resilient organisations. You also, I mean, I've got to say, people are tired after back-to-back crises, and that'd be the same in all over Australia and in New Zealand. So resilience has been pretty critical. Yeah. The work we're doing on talent management with Egon Zender around our Band 3s and agency heads shows resilience actually one of our real strengths, which is in fact one of our faults as a public service, because we tend to leave it all to themselves or to them to actually manage their own careers, and we're trying to change that. But I think, as I say, there's a bunch of things about the characteristics we're looking for in terms of a leadership and what's necessary. And I do many senior selection panels, and the latest buzzword is sort of authentic. I mean, it sounds good, but I'm not sure what it means, actually, other than being, I guess, comfortable in your own skin. Yeah. So obviously, I've set out a few sort of criteria on strong leaders we're looking for. And I might finish with a quote from a senior leader I know who said, and I quote him, "If I walk into a room and I'm the smartest person present, I get very nervous. I just want to have the soundest of judgment." I think that's absolutely right.
And authentic can be a good and a bad thing. I interviewed someone once for a chief marketing officer in a department and asked him why he wanted the job as the opening Christian. And he said, "Well, I'd like one more promotion before I retire."
That's authentic.
It's authentic, not a great answer. I'm wondering, Peter Hughes, I just want to, and then Katrina, I want to pursue this training thing just a little further. And Peter, there's always tension in recruiting and training public servants for leadership, as we just heard from the Australian Public Service Commissioner. We tend to stress strategy and policy as the thing we teach, yet most of the work is actually going to be about service delivery. How do you think of leadership in a public organisation, and how does the State Services Commission work out which skills it wants to promote in future public servants?
Yeah. I'm just going to correct you, Glyn, on our title. We've now got a new bit of legislation, the Public Service Act, and we are now the Public Service Commission, and I'm now the Public Service Commissioner of New Zealand. And this is really important because this is the first time in 60 years that the words public service appear in the Act and in my job title. And it's really important because actually that's what we're about, public service. So just make that. Just make that point.
You're going to need to talk to Wikipedia because they're way behind.
I won't talk about Australia because I'm about to offend some people, but like in my experience, there's kind of a hierarchy. I don't know where this comes from. Where kind of strategy is the apex, policy is next, and service delivery is the bottom end of Maslow's hierarchy. It's kind of not how I think about it. They should all be equal partners. You know, if the service delivery people aren't there around the table when the design decisions are being made, we're going to lose something. If the policy people aren't there when the delivery decisions are being made, we're going to lose something. So I think we need to learn to think about these things in a different way and run our policy processes in a less linear, sequential way and a more joined up team way. You would never, ever, ever in the private sector think about designing a product for delivery without having sales people involved. You just would never do that. And yet we do that all the time in the public service. So I think we need different models of policy development and service delivery. Leadership, look, to be frank, the biggest issue that I'm encountering is people getting their heads around and getting to grips with this notion of leading out of role, not out of authority. So right across our public service now, we have secretaries organised in teams with someone designated the leader. And we're not used to that. We're not used to having one of our peers in charge. We're used to having one of our superiors in charge. And so we just all got to learn that sometimes we have to take responsibility for leading. Sometimes we have to take responsibility for being led. It's a role, it's not a hierarchy. And just to pick up Peter and Katrina's points about your ability to work effectively in teams will be a core competency of the public service into the future. Absolutely core to the way we work, because we will not be working through formal vertically integrated hierarchies. We'll be working in horizontal teams, virtual arrangements, maybe digitally enabled a lot of the time, and that's going to be the organisation form of the future, not these buildings and, you know, organisation charts that we're all kind of used to. So it's the mindset shift involved in that I'm finding the biggest challenge, but also, you know, one of the most exciting things about the future.
Thank you for that. And Katrina, has COVID changed what you're looking for in a senior public servant and how you'll recruit and how you'll train?
Yeah, look, I'd probably echo the comments of both Peters, and, you know, there's a lot of writing and study around about adaptive leadership, and I think that sort of leadership is required going forward. And I know ANZSOG does some great teaching around adaptive leadership, and I actually might quote a former secretary I used to work with, and he's very much said, as a leader, you need to know yourself and know the times. But I would probably expand that to, you need to know yourself, you need to know the times, and you need to commit to ongoing learning. So that's really about seeing every challenge, every experience as a learning opportunity, and then building that back into what you're doing. So that's probably, in a nutshell, for me, somebody that really is a learner. And if you do think you're the smartest person in the room, there's actually a real problem there, I think.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn now to the post-COVID world, and now that we've got 3 public service commissioners on the one call, we get a chance to explore a bit of that. I mentioned the Decameron to show how the world that emerges from a pandemic is a different place. The studies of the Black Plague make exactly the same point. The slow trends are suddenly accelerated, power structures are disrupted, the relativities are upset. After the Black Death, for example, there was a severe labour shortage and suddenly feudalism wasn't possible. It diminished the authority of the local elites, it strengthened the towns, it centralised power in emerging national governments. So there's been much speculation about what the long run effects of COVID might be. And people are thinking about digital transformation, which is breaking up existing institutions such as schools and universities, less reliance on fixed workplaces and the associated commuting, more devolution of organisation, even as public health measures strengthen the authority of elected officials. And so it's interesting to think about whether the trajectory we were seeing in 2019 has continued. And Katharina, I'm going to turn back to Service New South Wales, if I may, because that's such a really interesting, much praised innovation from the New South Wales government, bringing together multiple channels and data in a single delivery point. I know there are analogues in other jurisdictions, including New Zealand. But can you say something about the thinking behind the Department of Customer Service that was created in July last year, which has a strong focus on innovation around user experience, the point Peter Hughes just made around designing programs? And then did that vision survive COVID? Was it strengthened, changed, adapted during COVID?
Yeah, look, I think the New South Wales government has had a focus on customer service for quite a number of years now, and it's reflected in Premier's priorities and it's reflected in a lot of things we do. And to me, the establishment of the Department of Customer Service simply represented a sharpening of that focus on customer service and I suppose an evolution of how we're organising the machinery of government in New South Wales to support that customer service. And I think as far as I'm aware, the Department of Customer Service is an Australian first, possibly a world first. I don't know of another department with that same name. Its mission is very much to, I guess, lead the work that is being done in the sector to shape the government, the New South Wales government, to be the world's most customer-centric government. And as part of their mandate, they also lead the sector's work in relation to digital. They do things like find ways that the sector can deliver more services online. They're implementing a tell us once policy so that people don't have to give us their information over and over again, noting that we're building privacy protections to that. We've seen Service New South Wales roll out their app, which is now used by more than 1.7 million people in New South Wales. We've introduced a digital driver's licence, which is used by, I think, more than one in 3 drivers now. So there's some of the, I guess, really practical digital things that have been done. The Department of Customer Service also has within it the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre and the Behavioural Insights Unit, both of which have played really key roles during COVID, I might add. In terms of other things they do, the department also supports the governance arrangements and administrative arrangements surrounding the government's Digital Restart Fund. So there's, I think, something like $1.6 billion has been put into that fund now, and it's supporting work on improving customer service. So we're doing a whole lot of work around customer journeys. And it's also supporting work to lift the digital capability of the sector as a whole. So we have a digital capability framework that we've got for the sector, and we're kind of building out the learning for that. So in terms of, I guess, the way forward, I would say Service New South Wales is a model that has proven to work in sort of good times and also in hard times like during COVID and the bushfires. So it really is that one-stop shop public interface for a whole range of services and transactions provided across government, and the feedback from customers is that they like it. They don't need to try and navigate their way around the different government agencies. There's a single door to enter into the service. So I think that's the role of Service New South Wales in the future. It will continue. It actually remained open during COVID, and we actually added 1,000 new customer service staff to Service New South Wales during the pandemic.
Can I just ask you about that? Because I remember talking to the person who was running one of the offices in the middle of Sydney, in fact, the Service New South Wales office, very positive about the experience and what it achieved. But he said in passing that the single most common inquiry he got over the counter was, how do I get a Medicare benefits form? So can you just say a little about getting state and Commonwealth to work together? In a sense, if you want to go and get a passport, you have to pick up a driver's license from Service New South Wales and then walk around to the Department of Foreign Affairs elsewhere in the city to organise your passport.
Yeah, I think that's an area where we're really ripe for opportunity, aren't we, to make it easier for citizens to not only navigate within a government, but across levels of government, including Commonwealth and local government as well. And I might just give an example of something that Service New South Wales and the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages recently launched, which is a death notification service, as an example of how this is brought to life. So if you have a loved one that dies, we all know that you have to notify a whole lot of people, from banks to insurance companies to Commonwealth agencies to state agencies. Well, this service will allow you to, provide that information once, and those notifications can be done on your behalf to the list of organisations you want to be notified. So that's just, I guess, one example of, where we're trying to make it more seamless for customers.
Thank you, Katharina. A variation on the question, if I may, for you, Peter Hughes. Before COVID, but again in the 2020 general election, the New Zealand government stressed the idea that there'd be a very small number of national priorities, and they stressed collaboration around shared outcomes to break down organisational barriers. And that's been a theme of many of your comments here today. Has COVID accelerated that trend, challenged it, made it more possible?
I think our experience is similar to yours in Australia. So, we've been able to accelerate things like flexible working from home, digital interconnection, especially on the service side, those sorts of things. Having a clear single focus makes a huge difference. So another bit of heresy, if you like, Glyn, is what if we organise the public service around the difference we're trying to make rather than the products and services we deliver? So if a priority for government is climate change or reducing child poverty or improving housing, what if we organised around those priorities rather than our products and services? So that's something we're starting to experiment with here. So on the back of COVID and the government's huge investment, one of the big issues is jobs, employment. So we've stood up a team of departmental secretaries, all the relevant agencies around that, with that single focus and a single plan. So, what if we actually organised around the priorities going forward rather than the status quo, the business as usual? If you look around the world, people are doing variants on this. They're doing something similar in Singapore, you'll know about, for example. So I think COVID, and of course we've had the mosque terrorist act in Christchurch here, and also Whakaari White Island eruption. Each of these has given us an opportunity to really push forward a bit more on that front. And frankly, I think we have to. I think we have to.
Fascinating. Thank you. And Peter Walcott, when you think about COVID and the APS, is this a temporary dislocation, a disruption, or are we working our way to what will be new and permanent ways of working in the APS?
Yeah, obviously we all hope it's a temporary dislocation, and the news around vaccines is looking actually increasingly positive. So I hope we're not facing a sort of a Decameron type future, and we're not going to be like Italy then or now. But so we're all preparing for the future of work. We were doing that before COVID-19. And what has happened this year, and both Katrina and Peter have been talking about this, is that many reforms to the way we were thinking about how we should work in the future have actually been accelerated. And they've been done rapidly and at scale, whether it be a more joined up approach, whether it be technology. And so important to obviously learn, and we're doing that now, to try and lock in what we want to keep, and also and adapt to those things that might not work quite so well. So obviously, I think we did come together very much in terms of the Commonwealth as one APS. Yeah. I think what particularly impressed me actually was around evidence-based decision making. That really came to the fore with COVID, and I think will leave a lasting legacy. There's a real thirst for data in government now, and I think that's been sort of hugely important to the way we've managed COVID, and also what the expectations now are of the Australian people and public in relation to how government addresses problems. So looking to sort of lock all that in. And I also think that in terms of some of the sort of things we want to lock in, it's around the increasing importance of understanding stakeholders, the use of technology, and obviously, as I say, New South Wales is something of a model for that for Services New South Wales, but a lot of thinking going into how we do that. So it's also ensuring that our senior public service or leadership understand, they're comfortable with where digital is going, and where data and the importance of data. And I very much also take Peter's point about the importance of service delivery. I mean, what we're facing next 12 months, 24 months, is really a focus on implementation. And so in terms of the skills we're looking for, it's doers as much as thinkers, and that's going to be very important.
Yeah, thank you for that. So great set of answers. I really appreciate it. And we've got a number of questions that have come through the Zoom Q&A function, which I'm keen to try out and just invite each of you to respond relatively briefly. And I'd like to start with the question of mobility, which has been raised by Don Nichols. And observing that lots of people were sort of seconded into task forces and asked to step outside their standard roles during the COVID crisis, and that's part of the adaptability we've been talking about. But the suggestion is that we're not all that good at mobility. It's a perennial problem. We can all see the benefits, and yet people are more comfortable staying where they are, and or it's very administratively, in career terms, difficult. So can I ask each of you just how COVID might have influenced your thinking about mobility and whether you see changes ahead? And Katharina, if you would like to start.
Yeah, I'd probably share two things, and I would agree with Dom's comment that we really haven't optimised mobility, certainly not in the jurisdiction I work in. There are provisions for mobility in legislation, but we certainly haven't optimised them. So I suppose I've got two suggestions around that. The first is that we need to get better at talent identification and talent management. There's a couple of things that we've tried in New South Wales, and I think that we could continue to build on. So we've had the Secretaries Board do a talent discussion or moderation about all of the people at Deputy Secretary level. I think, which was useful, and as a result of that discussion, a number of people were moved. So, there were discussions about, are they in the right place at the moment? Will they benefit from a broadening of their experience, et cetera, where people have been through a rigorous process and people can trust the calibre of the people in the pool, then they can actually quickly pull people out of that pool and reduce time to hire, which has been an issue in New South Wales, and move people around a lot better. So they're two observations from me.
Thank you for that. Peter Hughes.
Yeah, I think Australia's a little ahead of us on this front. In the New Zealand system, emerging from the 90s, it's very bespoke and very devolved. There is no whole of service job families, grading structure, anything like that. So it's quite challenging being able to move people around across the system. Nevertheless, we're attempting to do it. The new Act gives us the ability to shift some of those settings, and we'll certainly be taking advantage of that. We did move a lot of people around, or we have moved a lot of people around through COVID. And this kind of lack of interoperability has been a real challenge. And also what Katrina is saying, just having a view of who is there, who is in the public service and what they can do is challenging. So I think we've got an opportunity to accelerate some changes to some of those settings. People want to do it. They want to move around. They want to have a whole of service career. They want, to be able to use their skills and talents more broadly across the system. I think we've got to change the settings to enable that.
Thanks, Peter. And Peter, we've got a follow-up from Lorelei Brealey, who asks, given COVID is not the only wicked problem we're going to face, how can we get better at bringing teams together like this and providing behind them the support so that cross-functional agency task forces become a way of operating rather than something you only do in an absolute crisis?
Yeah, no, look, thanks. I mean, all of us are sort of struggling a bit with mobility. We coped okay during COVID, but in terms of thinking for the future, we're setting up a surge reserve. Secretaries Board has decided to do that under the APSC. So we're looking to have about 4,000 people who have volunteered to be part of a reserve and can do basic training and do some basic training. And obviously we're thinking there in terms of less technical positions, but can go into Services Australia or ATO or Home Affairs. So that's one aspect. As Katrina was talking about talent management, knowing your talent, knowing who the right people are. And so we've obviously got a major push on in terms of understanding our SES cohort, who is the talent, what are their specialities, how can we use and make sure that they're available to be moved to help work on a problem, even if that's only for a temporary time. And then, of course, we set up the professions model, data, digital, and human resources. Mm-hmm. And there the thinking is if you need 5 data people for a particular problem you've got, you go to David Gruen, the head of the head of the data profession. You say, David, give us 5 people for this task for like a couple of months, and that is part of their role too. So we're trying to think of imaginative ways in which we can do this to get the right people into the right job at the right time, and that is a big focus of ours.
Right. Well, and while you have the floor, can I share a question from Lola Jones, which is in a sense, what have we learned from National Cabinet about ways to improve coordination and horizontal integration, something we touched on a minute ago?
Yeah, I think, well, what have we learned from there? I mean, the key thing is that you don't have too many things on your agenda. You focus on particular issues that are really important for you. That is driven from the top. I think one of the problems with COAG before, it was a heavily bureaucratic structure in the worst way. And when it's driven from the top, things tend to happen, and that's important. It's got flexibility in the system. And I think one of the things I would like to see in terms of trying to sort of work horizontally across the Federation, and it's something that I've talked to Katrina about, and also Peter Hughes and Helene Quilter, or the other public service commissioners, is working quietly under the political radar in terms of all those areas that we can actually start doing things to learn off each other, piggyback off each other, not reinvent the wheels, cooperate with each other on any range of issues which we're all struggling with, because many of us are struggling with the same issues. So how do we as commissioners also actually take the agenda forward?
Katrina, do you want to come in on National Cabinet from your perspective? Have you found the level of integration that's become possible under this process?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with everything Peter Walcott's just said about, having a narrow focus on your highest priorities. I think the other thing I would add to that is that through COVID, I guess National Cabinet's been supported by the Chief Health Officers. So I think there is a role for expert advice to National Cabinet, and I think Peter referred to before about the use of evidence. So I think who is giving them that advice, making sure that the right people are feeding that advice and expert evidence into International Cabinet to allow those decisions to be made.
Right, thank you for that. Now, Peter Hughes, I'm delighted that somebody has responded to your provocation about the regions. Melissa Aduka asks, how do we give local governments, the local areas, the flexibility they need while still meeting community expectations on the accountability of secretaries and ministers, and as she notes, particularly when things go wrong?
Look, I think it's a point of balance. So when I was in Gisborne last week, all I wanted, so there is more than enough resources going into that community to make the difference that we need to make. All that they wanted was a bit of flexibility in the deployment of those resources. So I think it's about, the tight, loose thing. So we need to get a bit looser with our programs. We need to get a bit tighter with the priorities at a regional level, and that's how you achieve management control over it. So I think it's about regional leadership, including local government here, which is the democratically elected government in the regions, working in partnership with central government on the priorities, and then getting that tight loose thing a bit more optimally arranged. We figured out in Gisborne last Friday, actually get a long way just by using the flexibility that already exists in those programs. It's already there. We just have to think to use it. And also, locally, they're pretty damn good at bending the rules and twisting the rules to get on and do the right thing. And, you know, we just have to trust them to do the right thing. They're not going to do the wrong thing. Pretty much most people, most of the time, will get it mostly right. We don't need to prescribe it in intricate detail from the centre.
I agree, but isn't part of the problem here the political overlay problem of that makes perfect sense until you try to explain it to a journalist who's looking for a story?
That exists anyway. Look, I said to them in Gisborne on Friday, what do we do if the national priorities and the regional priorities are different? And they said, are you kidding? What do you think the priorities here are? And they're pretty self-evident what the priorities are, and they won't be any different from the national priorities for making a difference in that region. Look, we all work in the fishbowl environment. We all need to be risk aware, but sometimes I think when we're risk averse, we actually create problems that feed the monster, if you like, that don't exist. And we just need to learn to trust our people and their judgment a little bit more. So I think we're gonna try some stuff in Gisborne here in New Zealand. Just try some stuff and see what we can learn. See how far along that continuum we can come. I think we can make quite a big difference with some small shifts.
Sounds good. I hope you're going to evaluate and publish so that we all get to read about it. Yeah.
Being an academic goldmine, Glyn.
Absolutely. That's right. Some of us have got careers to think about after all. We've got a really nice question from Sonia Corsini, perhaps to all three, who asked how we're going to, having learned from 2020, how we're going to make sure that the lessons go home and we don't slip back to our old ways. And Katharina, would you like to have a shot at this?
Sure, and I think it's about being very deliberate about it. It's working out what is it that we want to keep and hard code, and then what actions need to be taken to embed those things, and in some cases resource and fund those things. So a couple of examples in New South Wales, you know, virtual courts did work really well, and there are aspects of that that we want to continue into the future. So we're actually putting money into it. We're also looking at our ways of working in the public service, and there are things that we did during COVID that we really want to keep, such as the flexible work, such as mobility, you know, such as that shift to digital. So how do we make those things happen? Well, we're looking at things like what sort of leadership do we need, what sort of culture do we need, and do our industrial settings properly support what we need to do. So we've been very deliberate and doing it in a planned way.
That's a significant and important answer. Thank you for that. And Peter Wilcott, how are we going to make sure the APS doesn't slide back?
Well, I guess that's part of my job, isn't it? Look, there's a confluence of thinking which started with Terry Moran and his blueprint report, and which the 30 report, which I mentioned before, and you are very much involved in, Glyn, and so is Peter Hughes. And it all points the same way in terms of the direction where we want to go. And so that's been accepted by government, and you've got a Prime Minister who is very focused on delivery. And he's not interested in silos, he's not interested in sort of excuses about this is the way things have traditionally worked. He wants to cut through all that stuff and just deliver on terms of the policies and for Australians. So all the pressure is to actually do this. And my sense is COVID, as I said, has accelerated all this. And you're already seeing, I think, in terms of the way the Secretaries Board is operating, very much more as a governance board in terms of the Commonwealth. And so there's a subcommittee, there's subcommittees being set up, one around digital, chaired by Catherine Campbell from the Secretary of Social Services, which is on technology, which is making sure that the technology systems that address and the Australian people work, that the internal technology systems are actually working. The idea you can go and set up your own IT system now is a fantasy. There's a lot, and the government's putting money in behind the technology as well. But there's got to be a plan, there's got to be an audit, there's got to be a blueprint. But you do see this in a whole range of different areas where there's a clear sense of where we have to go. That's not actually in dispute. There'll always be sort of people who might like to be more comfortable where they were. Yeah. But I get a strong sense that it's driven from the top, from the Prime Minister down through the Secretaries Board, and there's a pretty clear vision of where we want to go. So I'm pretty optimistic that whatever stumbles that will be on the way, we're well on path.
Thank you, Peter. And Peter, here's a related question from Carla, and that's how are we going to avoid COVID fatigue and broadly reform fatigue? How are we going to make sure that we keep on track here and we don't lose people, because it's been a very exhausting 2020?
Well, COVID fatigue is very real, and it really just comes back in my book to looking after people. You know, you're making sure that they're rested, that they get leave, that people get rotated in and out of key roles, that we're not relying on the same people over and over again. But it's very real. It's very real. I often say, like, you know, you sometimes encounter people who are less enthusiastic about change. In today's world, it's not the fact of change that you need to worry about, because that's inevitable. It's how it's led and managed. That's the issue, not the fact of change. So we've got to get really good at leading and managing change, and doing it in ways that are less abrupt and damaging of people. We've got to get good at, you know, pivoting organisations, refocusing organisations without doing big, bloody surgical restructures the whole time. We just got to get damn good at it. So, and COVID's a bit of a test at that. At the end of the day, these organisations that we lead and manage are all about the people in them. They're knowledge organisations. That's the, you know, if you put the thing on the market, that's what you would be selling. And that's what we've got to look after and protect and enhance and build and develop.
Thank you for that. So we're coming to the end, sadly. It's been a fabulous conversation. I'm going to invite each of our panelists just to give us a sentence to finish on their aspirations for what 2021 looks like for the public sector. What are they looking for as the key levers to make a change? And Katharina, would you like to start?
I actually might pick up on what Peter Hughes was just talking about, and that's the issue of well-being and looking after our people. So I think that, you know, we have been through a really challenging year. Our people have risen to the occasion. I'm encouraging people to take a good break and come back refreshed. And I think one of the good things that have come out of COVID, if I could put it that way, is that I think people are much more open now about talking about well-being and talking about mental health, and I'd like that to continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Peter Wilcott, what are you looking forward to in 2021 for?
Yeah, I think the point that Katrina was making is, and Peter Hughes, is people are tired. So people need a rest. But clearly 2021 is going to be a very big year, and it's going to be about implementation. Yeah. And the demands on us are going to be continually very high, and so it'll be another challenging year. But so do come back rested.
Thank you. And Peter Hughes, now that you have a new title.
Public service, that's what it's about. So, look, I'm hugely proud of the New Zealand Public Service and what they've done through COVID response. We've, as much as anybody else, led the response to this thing, and they absolutely have risen to the challenge. And the really good thing is the people of New Zealand have seen that and responded to that and supported that. So what I hope for next year is to find more and more ways for New Zealanders to see the difference that public servants in our country make, because I sometimes think it's not visible, and I sometimes think we get a bad rap when actually the reverse should be happening more often.
Thank you. Very eloquently done. Can I say thank you? I think we've been very fortunate to have three such important public service leaders speak with us this afternoon. Katharina, Peter and Peter, thank you each for a thought-provoking discussion and for the work that you do in your jurisdiction. It really matters. Thank you to my colleagues at ANZSOG who've organised this series and made it possible. A lot of behind-the-work scene necessary to get us here. And before we go, let me remind you, if you're interested, that the next masterclass will be from Professor Cheryl Saunders, and she's leading the charge on working smarter across jurisdictions, some of the issues we've taken up this afternoon, the future of federation. But until then, thank you very much for being part of this ANZSOG series. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you, our audience, for great questions and for being part of this. We'll see you again.